A baby and his beggar mother are at a traffic light near the airport in the rain, when a millionaire stops and hands over his house keys. But when he returns, he is shocked by what he finds. John Walker was a man accustomed to the frenetic pace of New York City's business life. His jam-packed schedule revolved around unmissable meetings, multi-million-dollar deals, and international flights. That morning, he had woken up earlier than usual, eager for a crucial trip to Tokyo, where he was set to close a deal that could double his company's value. The sky, gray and foreboding, signaled the rain that would soon pour relentlessly over the city. Despite his rush, John stuck to his meticulous routine. Black coffee, no sugar, a quick scan of the most critical emails, one last call to his assistant, Amanda, with detailed instructions for the coming days. He checked his watch, noting he had little time left before his flight. Climbing into his luxury sedan, he relied on his driver to navigate Manhattan's infamous traffic. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can hit our goal of 1,000 subscribers. As the car crept through the wet streets, thick raindrops began sliding down the windows. John, impatient, tapped his fingers on his knee. His mind was entirely consumed by the meeting ahead, the numbers he needed to present, and the impression he had to make on the investors. He barely noticed the chaos outside. Pedestrians dashing for cover, horns blaring in a cacophony, and water pooling along the curbs. Suddenly, in the middle of the commotion, something caught his attention. At a busy street corner near a traffic light, he spotted a woman sitting on the sidewalk, huddled against the wall of a building. Beside her, a baby whimpered softly, partially covered by a piece of cardboard. The woman was drenched, her expression a mix of desperation and resignation as she tried to shield the child from the unrelenting rain. John blinked, surprised he had noticed the scene at all. It wasn't like him. His world rarely intersected with the lives of people like this woman. But for some inexplicable reason, something inside him compelled him to take a closer look. It was as if, for a fleeting moment, the noise of his own life had quieted, allowing him to see beyond the bubble of luxury he inhabited. The rain poured relentlessly, turning Manhattan streets into a wet, chaotic mess. From inside his car, John watched the traffic light slowly shift to red. The driver muttered something about the gridlock, but John didn't listen. His gaze remained fixed on the woman and her baby. Rain streamed down her tangled hair, and the cardboard she clung to was beginning to disintegrate. The child, curled against her, let out faint, almost inaudible whimpers, drowned out by the storm and the blaring horns. John felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a pang of discomfort. He was a practical man, always driven to solve problems with efficiency and logic. Yet here he was, stuck in traffic, feeling utterly powerless. He could easily ignore the scene, as he did with the countless problems he witnessed on the streets daily. After all, his priority was to get to the airport and ensure his company continued to thrive. But something about that image seemed to root itself deep in his mind, refusing to be dismissed. As the traffic light remained red, he rolled down the car window, letting icy rain droplets stream inside. The driver turned to him, surprised, and asked if everything was okay. John didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the woman, as though trying to decipher what was stirring within him. Finally, he made a decision, something irrational, completely out of character for his usual logical self, yet it felt inevitable. "Stop the car," he ordered, his voice firm. The driver hesitated but pulled over to the curb, complying. John stepped out, feeling the rain instantly soak through his expensive suit. He crossed the street, weaving between hurried pedestrians and enduring puzzled stares, until he reached the sidewalk where the woman sat. Up close, the scene was even more heartrending. The baby's face was flushed red from the cold, and the woman appeared to be trembling, perhaps from exhaustion or hunger. John crouched down, ignoring the discomfort of the rain against his skin. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentler than he expected. The woman looked up at him, startled and wary. She didn't respond immediately, but her gaze told a story of someone long accustomed to being ignored. "My name is John Walker," he continued, as if that might mean something to her. "Can I help you?" She hesitated, then murmured something that sounded like an apology for being there. John cut her off, unwilling to hear justifications. He pulled a set of keys from his pocket. "Take this. This is my house. Go there with your child. It's empty. You'll have a safe place to stay." Emily stared at the keys in John's hand with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. It was as if reality had suddenly shifted into something she couldn't comprehend. A stranger, dressed like someone who had never known hardship, was offering her a sanctuary she had never dared to imagine. For a few moments, she hesitated, clutching the baby tightly against her chest. "Why are you doing this?" The question escaped her lips in a low voice, barely audible over the sound of the rain. Her tone carried not only doubt but the weight of years of rejection and despair. She didn't know what to expect from this man. Perhaps it was a cruel joke, or maybe an impulsive gesture he'd forget the moment he walked away. John tilted his head, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no clear reason he could articulate. In that moment, he wasn't the shrewd, calculating businessman. Something inside him compelled him to act, an instinctive sense that, for once, he needed to do something beyond numbers and contracts. "Because I can," he replied simply. "And because no one should be in this situation, especially with a child." He held the keys out, wordlessly insisting that she take them. With trembling hands, Emily accepted the keys. They felt absurdly heavy, not because of their physical weight, but because of the immense change they could signify. I don't know what to say." Her voice broke, and her eyes filled with tears she struggled to hold back. "You don't need to say anything," John replied, already standing. He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. "This is the address. Everything is ready for you and your child. There's food in the pantry and clothes you can use. I just ask that you take care of the place. I'll be out of town for a few days." Emily nodded silently, still processing what had just happened. John, now thoroughly soaked, gave her one last look before returning to the car. As he closed the door, the driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. As the car resumed its journey to the airport, John glanced one last time at Emily, still standing on the sidewalk with the baby in her arms. He felt something different, a lightness that didn't come from business success. Perhaps it was the feeling of having done something right, even if he didn't fully understand why. As John's car disappeared into the rain, Emily stood motionless for a moment, clutching the keys tightly, as if afraid they might vanish from her hands. The reality around her felt suspended, a blur between disbelief and the faint glimmer of hope. Noah whimpered softly, bringing her back to the present. She looked at the baby, his skin cold and damp. She had no choice. She had to try. With hesitant steps, Emily began walking, following the directions on the business card John had given her. The paper was slightly crumpled, and the letters were starting to smudge from the rain, but it was still legible. She pulled the frayed hood of her coat over Noah's head to shield him from the cold as she made her way through the bustling streets. People glanced at her indifferently, as they always did, but she didn't care. For the first time in months, there was something tangible ahead of her, an address that promised shelter. The walk felt endless. Her legs ached, and exhaustion threatened to overtake her at every corner. When she finally saw the building mentioned on the card, Emily stopped and stared, her heart racing. It was an imposing mansion with an elegant brick facade and large windows softly illuminated by warm light. It seemed unreal that such a place could be within reach for someone like her. For a moment, she thought about turning back. The idea of stepping into such a luxurious space felt intrusive, like something she had no right to do. But then Noah whimpered again, and that was enough to make her move forward. Emily walked up to the entrance and, with shaky hands, tried to fit the key into the lock. After a few moments of nervous fumbling, she managed to open the door. The interior of the house was even more breathtaking than she had imagined. A grand entry hall stretched out before her, with gleaming marble floors and a spiraling staircase that seemed to lead to another world. It was a stark contrast to the last few months of her life, spent in overcrowded shelters and freezing sidewalks. She stepped in slowly, closing the door behind her, and immediately felt the warmth envelop her. The silence was almost overwhelming, broken only by the sound of Emily's footsteps and Noah's soft murmurs. She looked around, feeling small and out of place, yet overwhelmed by a sense of relief she hadn't felt in a long time. She walked into the living room, where a large, comfortable sofa seemed to beckon her to sit. For the first time in months, she let her shoulders relax and took a deep breath. Emily stood up again and began exploring the rooms, eventually finding a guest bedroom with a clean bed and soft blankets. She placed Noah there, wrapping him in a warm blanket, and stood by his side, watching as he finally drifted off to sleep. Beside the bed was a shelf filled with books and a small lamp that cast a cozy glow over the room. Tears streamed down her face. It wasn't just the physical comfort. It was the overwhelming feeling that, against all odds, someone had given her a chance. As the night wore on, Emily sat in an armchair in the living room, surrounded by a silence that felt both comforting and intimidating. The constant noise of the streets, a permanent backdrop to her life, was absent. Everything here was orderly, clean, and somehow removed from the reality she knew. Emily looked down at her hands, which were still trembling slightly, as though unable to fully process what had happened. Her mind wandered. She remembered sleepless nights spent in fear of what might happen on the streets, always on alert for the footsteps of strangers or Noah's cries, which often went unanswered. The contrast was so stark it almost hurt. Now, she was sitting in a place where danger seemed non-existent, but with that came an unexpected feeling: guilt. Why her? Why had that man, with all the resources in the world, chosen to help her? She stood and began exploring again. The kitchen, spacious and fully equipped, looked like something out of a television show. She opened the refrigerator to find shelves packed with food, much of which she didn't even recognize. For a moment, she felt out of place, as though she didn't have the right to touch anything. But then she glanced down the hall, where Noah was peacefully sleeping. He needed her. He needed her to make decisions now, no matter how daunting it felt. Emily grabbed something simple, a loaf of bread and some milk. She prepared a quick snack and returned to the living room, eating in silence. To most, it would have seemed insignificant, but to her, it was a luxury. Every bite seemed to dissolve a little of the fear she carried. Later, she went to the bathroom and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her face appeared older than she remembered, etched with lines of exhaustion from the constant struggle to survive. But there was something new in her eyes now, a spark of determination. John's gesture had planted a small seed of hope, and she knew she couldn't let it go to waste. Before going to sleep, Emily went back to Noah's room. She stood by the makeshift crib she had arranged for him, listening to his steady breathing. "You're going to have a better life," she whispered, tears rolling down her face once again. "I promise." For the first time in a long while, Emily was able to sleep. The soft mattress felt like a cloud, and the silence of the house wrapped around her like a warm embrace. There was no more cold, no more fear, only the promise that tomorrow might be different. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the elegant curtains of the room where Emily slept. For a brief moment, as she opened her eyes, she didn't recognize where she was. The softness of the bed and the warmth of the room were so different from everything she had endured in the past months that her brain needed a few seconds to adjust to reality. When she finally remembered, she felt a mix of relief and disbelief. Emily got up carefully, making sure Noah was still sleeping peacefully. As she looked at him, nestled in the clean, soft blanket, A wave of emotion swept over her. The calm face of the baby was a reminder of why she fought every day. This miracle wasn't for her, it was for him. She left the room and walked down the sunlit hallway, her bare feet feeling the pleasant coolness of the wooden floor. Passing through the living room, she noticed details she hadn't seen the night before. The carefully hung paintings, the furniture that exuded elegance, and even the faint, clean scent that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. Everything about it seemed to declare order and stability, things Emily wasn't sure she could uphold. Arriving in the kitchen, she found a note pinned to the refrigerator. It was from John. "Use whatever you need. There's a phone in the living room in case anything happens. I'll be gone for a few days, but I'll check in when I return. Don't hesitate to call if necessary." Emily held the note for a moment, as if trying to decipher the man behind those words. The gesture seemed so far removed from what she would expect from someone with his appearance and status. She spent the morning exploring more of the house, still cautiously, as if each movement required permission. She discovered a small library upstairs, filled with books on business, philosophy, and even design. The latter caught her attention immediately. Before her life had turned upside down, Emily had studied graphic design, but a lack of resources and personal struggles had buried that dream years ago. Now, as her fingers brushed over the books, she felt a spark of something she thought she had lost forever. By noon, while Noah took another nap, Emily decided she needed to start giving back somehow. She tidied up the kitchen, cleaned the countertops, and even ventured to organize a few items in the living room. It wasn't much, but it was something she could do to keep the space as welcoming as she had found it. Every gesture felt more meaningful than anything she had done in recent memory. As night fell, Emily sat in the library with one of the design books. As she read, her hands paused on a blank sheet of paper tucked inside. On impulse, she began sketching ideas much like she used to in the days when she still believed in building a future. The drawings flowed naturally, as if her mind was reconnecting with a talent that had never truly left her. In the days that followed, Emily began establishing a routine within the mansion. In the mornings, she cared for Noah, who seemed calmer and healthier with each passing day. The stability of having a warm place to stay and enough food was transforming the child, and Emily noticed it in the small smiles he now gave. Watching her son thrive under better conditions gave her the strength to confront her own feelings of inadequacy. In the afternoons, Emily dedicated herself to exploring the library, devouring books that awakened her dormant creativity. The sketches that began as simple lines on loose sheets of paper now evolved into more structured designs. Ideas for logos, illustrations, and even advertising campaigns began to take shape in her mind. She knew she was still far from using this talent professionally, but rediscovering something she loved was almost as nourishing as the food she could now prepare for herself and Noah. However, Emily's thoughts weren't filled with gratitude alone. A growing sense of worry began to take root. She was acutely aware that what John had done for her was extraordinary, almost unbelievable. He had given her access to something precious, and she feared that any mistake could cause it all to be taken away. She constantly questioned whether she was caring for the house well enough, whether she was worthy of such a gesture. Every step she took within the house was marked by excessive caution, as if a single misstep might ruin everything. One afternoon, while tidying the living room, Emily came across a framed photograph. It was of John, standing next to an older man she assumed was his father, in front of what appeared to be the very same building she now called home. Both men were smiling, but there was something distant in John's expression, as if his mind was somewhere else. Emily stared at the photo for a moment, trying to imagine who this man was beyond the remarkable gesture he had made for her. What had driven him to help her? And what, if anything, did he expect in return? As night fell, Emily put Noah to sleep and returned to the library. This time, she found a notebook with blank pages. It was simple yet inviting, as if it was waiting to be filled. She picked up a pen and, instead of sketching, began to write. The words flowed unexpectedly. She wrote about her life before everything fell apart, about the days when she believed the future was within her reach. She wrote about Noah, about the nights she carried him through the streets searching for shelter, about the fear of failing as a mother. But most of all, she wrote about the feeling of being indebted to a stranger who, for no apparent reason, had extended a hand when no one else had. When she finished, Emily closed the notebook and took a deep breath. For the first time, she felt that she wasn't merely surviving but beginning to reconnect with who she was. The house wasn't just a physical refuge. It was becoming a space where Emily could rebuild herself, piece by piece, until she could discover what she might offer in return for the miracle she had been given. As Emily began rebuilding her life within the walls of that house, John's routine in Tokyo continued with relentless intensity. The man who had made such a grand gesture of generosity was now fully immersed in meetings and presentations, surrounded by sharp-eyed investors and associates demanding his constant attention. Yet, in rare moments of pause, his mind wandered back to that rainy night. He wondered how the woman and her baby were adjusting to his home. It was a strange thought for someone like him, accustomed to compartmentalizing emotions and focusing exclusively on his goals. One particularly long evening, after a series of successful negotiations, John sat in the armchair of his hotel room, staring out at Tokyo's skyline, vibrant with lights. He held a glass of whiskey, but the amber liquid barely captured his attention. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning his own priorities. There was something different about that impulsive gesture he had made. It wasn't charity motivated by social convention or a calculated move to appear benevolent. It was something deeper, almost primal. He couldn't explain it, but he felt that opening his home had stirred something within him that he'd ignored for far too long. John thought back to his childhood, to how his mother had been a constant force in his life, despite the financial struggles they endured before he achieved success. She had been the one to teach him about hard work, but also about compassion, a value he had buried over the years in pursuit of greater ambitions. He wondered if his mother would approve of the man he had become, calculating, always focused on the next step, but rarely on the people around him. The next morning, while reviewing contracts, a notification from Amanda, his assistant, appeared on his phone. She informed him of a noticeable increase in energy and water usage at his Manhattan mansion. "It seems there's more activity in the house than expected. Do you want me to look into it?" John replied quickly, "No, leave it as it is," but the message made him wonder what Emily might be doing. He realized that, despite his curiosity, he hadn't made any concrete plans for what would happen when he returned. He trusted that she would make good use of the opportunity, but that trust felt like a risk, one he wasn't accustomed to taking. Throughout the day, John felt something new, a desire to return. It wasn't just about seeing his house or addressing financial matters. He wanted to see how Emily was transforming that space, and, more importantly, how it was transforming her. The trip, which had once felt like the pinnacle of his career, now seemed like merely an interlude before something bigger and more meaningful. Meanwhile, Emily felt time moving differently within the mansion. The days seemed both long and short, as if she were in a bubble where the outside world couldn't reach her. Each morning, she woke with a renewed sense of determination, inspired by Noah's peaceful smile, and began looking for ways to make that space, whether temporary or not, a place of rebuilding for herself and her son. One of those mornings, while flipping through the design books in the library, Emily came across what seemed to be a beginner's manual, filled with simple exercises to practice foundational concepts. The idea of returning to this craft, even in a modest way, sparked an excitement she hadn't felt in years. She grabbed some paper and a pencil and began sketching shapes, creating small logos, and exploring color combinations that came to her mind. Her work was interrupted by the sound of Noah playing with something in the living room. When she went downstairs, she found the baby holding a book from the lowest shelf, a beautifully illustrated volume on modern architecture. Emily chuckled softly, seeing Noah so captivated, as if her son was somehow absorbing the same creative energy. She picked him up and began flipping through the book with him, explaining in a gentle tone what some of the images were. It felt as though she was rediscovering the world alongside him. That afternoon, Emily decided to push further. She ventured into John's office, a space she hadn't entered before. The door was open, but she hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. She felt like an intruder, but curiosity won out. The office was meticulously organized, with a large dark wood desk, shelves lined with folders and files, and, at its center, a closed laptop. On the desk, she found a notepad with John's handwritten notes, drafts of ideas for business projects. Although she didn't fully understand the context, she was fascinated by his precise handwriting and the concise, almost cryptic, phrases. She didn't touch anything other than the notepad, which she carefully returned to its place. Before leaving, her eyes landed on a framed photo in the corner of the desk. It was of John with a smiling woman whom Emily assumed was his mother. The warmth in the woman's eyes was striking, almost familiar, and Emily felt a pang of gratitude. Without John, who had likely inherited some of that kindness, she would still be out in the rain without hope. As the day drew to a close, Emily returned to the library and resumed her work on her sketches. She was determined to create something meaningful, something she could show John when he returned, as a way to prove that his trust had not been misplaced. Though she didn't yet know how, she wanted him to see that his generosity had changed her life and that she was willing to give something back. The next morning, Emily woke with renewed determination. Enough time had passed since John had handed her the mansion's keys, and she knew he would return soon. Despite the progress she felt in rediscovering her passion for graphic design, insecurity lingered. Would he approve of how she had used this opportunity? What if he thought she hadn't done enough? These thoughts weighed on her as she tidied the kitchen and prepared Noah's breakfast. After feeding the baby, Emily decided to review the sketches she had worked on over the past few days. She spread the papers out on the library table, carefully examining the logos she had created, the color combinations she had tested, and the website layouts she had imagined. Some were better than others, but as she looked at the collection as a whole, she saw a glimmer of the person she used to be, creative, determined, and full of hope. While she was lost in thought, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house. Emily froze. Since arriving there, no one had ever rung the doorbell, and the sound brought back memories of all the times she had been driven away from places where she had sought shelter. Quickly, she picked up Noah and walked to the door, her heart racing. When she opened it, she was met with a delivery man holding a large box. He explained it was an automated grocery order for the house, likely something John had scheduled. Emily let out a sigh of relief and thanked him, carrying the box inside. Upon opening it, she found fresh food and even some items she didn't know how to use. It reminded her of how drastically her reality had changed in such a short time. Later, while exploring the pantry to organize the new groceries, she found a sealed envelope, likely forgotten among the shelves. Curiosity piqued. She opened it and discovered a letter written by John. It wasn't addressed to her. It seemed to be a draft of something he had never sent. In the letter, John wrote about his mother, about how she had shaped his worldview and encouraged him to always help others, even when he felt he didn't have enough to offer. He mentioned feeling disconnected from that teaching in recent years, lost amidst the success and demands of his work. The letter ended with a reflection. Maybe there's still a way to become the man she'd be proud to call her son. Emily read the letter twice, deeply moved. For the first time, she realized that the man who had extended his hand to her was also, in a way, trying to rediscover himself. He wasn't just a millionaire businessman who had everything under control. He was someone grappling with his own internal challenges, much like her. This discovery motivated her even more. Now, it wasn't just about proving she was worthy of the opportunity. It was about showing John that his gesture had made a difference, not just for her, but for himself. Emily resolved that when he returned, he would find not only a well-kept house but also a woman ready to start over. The day of John's return arrived quietly, catching Emily off guard. It was a morning like any other, and she was in the kitchen preparing Noah's breakfast when she heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Her heart raced, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. With Noah in her arms, she walked to the window and peeked out. The same sedan she had seen on that stormy night was there, and John was stepping out of the vehicle with his travel bag. Emily took a deep breath, quickly straightened her appearance, and wiped her hands on a towel. She wasn't sure how to greet him. He was, after all, the owner of everything around her, the man who had changed her life, but also a stranger whose motivations still remained a mystery to her. She placed Noah in the playpen in the living room and walked to the door to meet him. When John stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanned the space. Nothing seemed out of place, and the house was tidier than he remembered. There was something different in the air, an energy he couldn't quite define, but it made him realize that Emily wasn't just living in that space. She was beginning to transform it. "Welcome back," Emily said with a hesitant smile. Her voice was calm, but her posture betrayed a mix of gratitude and apprehension. John nodded and returned the smile, setting his suitcase down beside him. "How are you both?" he asked, his voice firm yet gentle. It was a simple question, but it carried a lot of weight. He was genuinely curious, perhaps even concerned, about what had happened during his absence. "We're doing well," Emily replied. "Better than I could have imagined. Thanks to you." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I hope I took good care of the house. I did my best to keep it as it was." John glanced around the room again, noticing the small changes she had made. A plant on the dining table, the books in the library neatly rearranged, a painting that had previously hung in a forgotten corner, now prominently displayed. He saw something unexpected. "Life. You did more than that," he said, surprising Emily. "The house feels better than ever." The compliment visibly relieved her, but it also gave her the courage to share what she had been working on. I'd like to show you something," she said, gesturing for him to follow her to the library. Noah, now awake and babbling happily in his playpen, seemed to mirror the growing energy in the room. In the library, Emily gathered the drawings she had been working on and arranged them in a folder. She handed it to John, explaining briefly what each one represented and how she had used the books as references. "I know it's a small start, but it's given me something I haven't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose." John studied the drawings in silence for a few minutes. There was something pure and determined in every line, something he recognized as the essence of what drives someone to create something meaningful. He closed the folder, looked at Emily, and smiled, this time with more warmth. "You're on the right path," he said, "and maybe it's not as small a start as you think." Emily felt a knot in her chest unravel. It wasn't just John's approval she had sought, but the reassurance that she was moving in the right direction. In that moment, she realized that, despite everything she had lost, she was beginning to recover what truly mattered: her confidence in herself. In the days following John's return, the dynamic in the mansion began to shift. He spent more time at home than Emily had anticipated, often working in his office or making phone calls from the terrace. Despite his presence, he didn't feel intrusive, as if he understood that the space had become as much hers as it was his. Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being observed, not with judgment, but with curiosity. One afternoon, while Noah was napping and the house was quiet, John found Emily in the kitchen. He was dressed casually, something Emily rarely imagined him wearing, and he held a mug of coffee. "Have you been exploring the library?" he asked, his tone more curious than formal. Emily nodded, drying her hands on a towel. "Yes, it's been transformative, really. There's so much in there that I never thought I'd have access to." has made a huge difference. John gave a faint smile, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. My mother loved books. Most of what's in there was hers. She believed knowledge and creativity were the only possessions no one could ever take away from you. The revelation caught Emily off guard. For a moment, she felt as though she had glimpsed a more intimate part of John, something that further humanized the man who had changed her life. She must have been an incredible woman, Emily replied sincerely. She was, John said, his smile tinged with melancholy. She always believed helping others was the best use of what we have. He paused before continuing. I lost sight of that for a while, I think. But seeing you here, doing what you're doing, reminds me of what she used to say. Emily remained silent, absorbing his words. She had never considered that her struggle to rebuild herself could impact someone like John. But here he was, seemingly reflecting on his own journey. Their conversation was interrupted by the soft sound of Noah crying from his room. Emily smiled and excused herself to tend to him. John stayed in the kitchen, gazing out the window at the garden. Something was shifting within him too. For the first time in years, he felt connected to something beyond his work or his wealth. Later that day, as Emily sketched in the library, John appeared again. This time, he carried a tablet and looked energized. I have an idea, he said, pulling a chair up beside her. Emily looked at him, intrigued. You have talent. That much is clear, he continued, and I think we can turn that into something bigger. A project that's for you but also for others like you. He opened the tablet and showed her some initial sketches he had made. Ideas for a graphic design training program aimed at women in vulnerable situations. We can use the resources I have, create a space to teach, provide tools, and maybe even job opportunities. Emily stared at the tablet, her mind racing. The concept was far beyond anything she had imagined for herself, but it resonated deeply. It wasn't just about her rebuilding her own life anymore. It was about creating a path for others to do the same. Emily was speechless for a moment. The idea seemed bigger than anything she could have imagined, but there was something about the way John spoke that made her believe it was possible. I don't know what to say, she confessed with a nervous smile. You don't have to say anything now, he replied. Just think about it. And if you want, we can work on this together. Emily looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see just a wealthy man who had helped out of compassion, but someone who believed in her enough to invest in her potential. In the days that followed, Emily reflected deeply on John's proposal. The idea of turning her passion for graphic design into something that could impact other lives felt both inspiring and daunting. She couldn't help but wonder if she was truly capable of taking on something so significant. Yet, there was something profoundly motivating about the fact that John believed in her. For the first time, she felt that her worth wasn't measured solely by what she had lost, but by what she could still create. One morning, after a restless night spent thinking about the future, Emily made her decision. She found John in his office, focused on his laptop, and approached hesitantly. When he looked up at her, he saw determination in her expression. I want to do this, she said firmly. I want to help other people like me, and I want to learn everything I need to make this work. John smiled, a smile that seemed to carry more pride than surprise. Great, let's start today. He explained the initial steps. The project would require planning, from designing a basic curriculum for the training program to finding partners who could assist with resources. John mentioned that he knew companies willing to invest in social initiatives but wanted Emily to lead the development of the idea. This is about you, he said. I can provide support, but the heart of it needs to be yours. Emily felt the weight of the responsibility, but also a spark of excitement. They spent the day working side by side in the library, turning ideas into concrete plans. Emily used her own experiences and past struggles as a guide, identifying what women in situations like hers would need to start anew. During a break, as they drank coffee in the living room, John shared more about his mother. He spoke about how she used to organize community events even when they had little money, always finding ways to help those in need. She believed it doesn't matter how much you have. What matters is what you do with it. Emily listened intently, feeling a deeper connection to John with every story. It wasn't just about his wealth or his resources. He carried forward the values instilled by someone who had once lived with far less but still found ways to give. And now he was passing that belief on to her. The words resonated deeply with Emily. She felt connected to the woman she had never met, as if, in some way, she was honoring her legacy by taking on the challenge John had proposed. By the end of the day, Noah was crawling around the living room, babbling sounds that drew laughter from both Emily and John. It was a moment of simplicity but also profound meaning. Emily realized that, for the first time in a long while, she was building something not just to survive but to truly live. Before they parted for the night, John handed Emily a new notebook with blank pages. You can use this to jot down ideas or sketches, whatever you want, but I want you to remember something. Every blank page is an opportunity, and you have all the potential to fill them. Emily held the notebook carefully, feeling the symbolism in the gift. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it with courage and hope. The initial steps in developing the project brought Emily a sense of fulfillment but also unexpected challenges. She and John worked intensely over the following days, refining the program's concept and drafting a plan of action. However, the weight of responsibility soon began to take its toll. There were decisions to be made, deadlines to meet, and, above all, the pressure Emily placed on herself to not disappoint the man who believed in her. One afternoon, as they discussed potential locations to launch the training program, Emily noticed John was quieter than usual. He seemed distracted, his gaze fixed on the laptop screen. "Is everything okay?" she asked, breaking the silence that lingered in the room. John hesitated for a moment before responding. "Yes, just trying to make sure this works as well as it possibly can." She knew there was more to it. John rarely showed vulnerability, but there was a tension in his face that Emily was beginning to recognize. He was just as invested in the success of the project as she was, and it made her realize they were both navigating their own insecurities. "We'll make it work," Emily said, with more confidence than she felt. "We might not have all the answers right now, but we have determination. And that's a pretty good start." John gave a small smile, as if her words had eased some of the pressure he was feeling. Later that day, while reviewing her notes, Emily encountered a concrete obstacle: the need for a detailed budget to present to potential financial partners. Her stomach tightened as she realized she had no idea how to structure something so complex. For a moment, insecurity threatened to overwhelm her, dredging up memories of past failures. But then, she looked at the notebook John had given her. Flipping through the blank pages, she remembered his words about opportunity and potential. Taking a deep breath, she resolved to figure it out one step at a time. It was then that Noah, sitting on the rug beside her, let out a loud laugh while playing with one of his toys. The sound brought Emily back to the present, reminding her why she was fighting so hard. She picked up the notebook John had given her and began sketching ideas, even though she wasn't entirely sure where to start. The next morning, Emily brought her notes to John, admitting her struggles. To her surprise, he didn't show any frustration. Instead, he suggested they work on the budget together, guiding her through the process. "You're not expected to know everything right away," he said with an encouraging tone. "What matters is that you're willing to learn." Working alongside John that day was a revelation for Emily. He wasn't just a mentor. He was a partner willing to share his knowledge and support her through the most challenging parts of the journey. Gradually, she began to understand how to turn her ideas into concrete figures, creating a plan that could convince investors to back the project. When they finally finished hours later, Emily felt a wave of pride. There was still so much to do, but that small progress was proof that she could overcome her own fears and limitations. The following weeks brought significant progress to the project, but also new challenges. Emily and John began reaching out to potential partners and companies that might support the initiative. For Emily, these meetings were a completely new and intimidating experience. Sitting across from executives in impeccable suits and presenting her ideas required a level of courage she hadn't known she possessed. In one of these meetings, held in a glass conference room in the heart of Manhattan, Emily faced her first major test. John encouraged her to lead the presentation, believing that her personal story would lend weight to their proposal. As she spoke, Emily felt her nerves threatening to take over. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the slides, but she kept her gaze steady on the faces in front of her, telling her story with honesty. She explained how the opportunity she had received had transformed her life and how she believed the project could do the same for so many others. When she finished, the room fell silent for a few moments that felt eternal. Then, one of the executives, an older man with a serious expression, leaned forward and broke the silence. "That's inspiring," he said, his tone sounding genuine. "But what's the concrete plan? How do you guarantee results?" The question caught Emily off guard. She glanced at John, who gave her a small nod, encouraging her to continue. Taking a deep breath, Emily explained the details of the plan she had helped create, from hands-on training sessions to partnerships with companies for job opportunities. Her voice grew stronger with each word, and she realized that John's confidence in her was bolstering her own. By the end of the meeting, a preliminary agreement was reached. The company agreed to provide initial support but made it clear they expected tangible results before committing long-term. Despite the conditions, Emily left the meeting feeling victorious. For the first time, something she had helped build was beginning to take shape in the real world. Back at the mansion that evening, while Noah slept, Emily sat on the couch next to John. Both were exhausted but content with the progress they had made. "You were incredible today," John said, breaking the silence. Emily smiled, feeling a genuine warmth in his words. "I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for believing in me." John shook his head. "I just gave you the initial push. What's happening now is because you had the courage to take the next step." In that moment, Emily realized there was something different about her relationship with John. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was a partnership that had transformed them both. He was no longer just the man who had handed her the keys to his house on a stormy night. Now, he was someone who made her believe she could achieve the impossible. Months later, the project Emily and John had envisioned finally came to life. A space was opened in a central neighborhood, transformed into a welcoming training center for women in vulnerable situations. Emily was at the forefront of everything, from organizing the space to leading the first classes. The facility was simple but thoughtfully designed, with workstations, computers, and even a small play area for mothers who brought their children. On the day of the grand opening, Emily felt nervous but also filled with pride. The event had attracted not only the first participants but also companies interested in supporting the initiative. John stood by her side, discreetly staying in the background to let her shine. When Emily stepped onto the makeshift stage to deliver a brief speech, she glanced at Noah, playing in the arms of a volunteer, and felt tears threatening to fall. "I used to believe there was no way out for me and my son," she began, her voice trembling. "But life showed me that sometimes, a single gesture can change everything. I was given an opportunity one never dreamed of, and today I'm here to help other women see that they, too, can start over." The audience applauded, and John felt a mix of pride and emotion. The journey that had begun on a rainy night had grown into something far greater than he had ever imagined. As he looked at Emily, he no longer saw just the woman he had helped, but a leader who was changing lives. As the event continued, one of the participants, a young woman named Rachel, approached Emily with a shy smile. "I saw myself in your story," she said. "Thank you for doing this. It's the first time in a long while that I've felt hope." Emily held the young woman's hand, feeling the weight of the moment. This was what she had been striving for, not just to change her own life, but to be a catalyst for other women. That evening, after the event, Emily and John returned to the mansion. Noah, exhausted, slept deeply in the car. In the living room, as the house's quiet enveloped them, Emily turned to John. "I'll never be able to thank you enough for what you've done for me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. John shook his head with a calm smile. "You already have. Today, seeing what you've created, I think you thanked me in the best way possible." Tears streamed down Emily's face, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. For the first time in a long while, she was at peace, knowing her life had been irreversibly transformed. Later that night, as she watched Noah sleep, Emily picked up the notebook where she recorded her ideas and wrote a new sentence on the first page. "The future is a blank page, and now I know how to start filling it." John, meanwhile, sat in his armchair in the office, gazing at the photograph of his mother. For the first time, he felt he was honoring the values she had always taught him. It wasn't just Emily who had changed. He, too, had found a purpose that went far beyond contracts and meetings. The sound of children's laughter echoed in both their minds that night, a silent promise that the path they had chosen to walk together was just the beginning of something far greater. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and a comment. Let us know which city you're watching from. A big hug, and see you in the next story.